Hello, everyone. My name is Darren Michaels. Welcome today. My name is Darren Michaels. I'm the host of this Scott Labs webinar series where we discuss interesting topics and try and answer questions related to wine, cider, or specialty beverage production. From yeast and nutrients to stabilization and filtration, we dip into the Scott Labs vault of over 80 years of experience to bring you the latest in research and technical applications. I'm Darren Michaels, and I'm your host during this journey. I'm a Scott Labs fermentation outside technical expert, originally from California, now living up in the Pacific Northwest in the beautiful Columbia River Gorge. Heat is finally here, and we're very happy to have it. I want to thank you all for attending, and thank you all for taking time out of your day to join us. Today, we are very lucky to have Maggie McBride, our Scott Labs wine stability guru, and all of her vast experience and expertise in finding applications with playing with dirt, specialized Bentonites for protein stability. Maggie started in the wine industry over 20 years ago, first at Beringer Vineyards as a lab tech, and while there worked her way up to enologist and eventually lab director. She went on to work at such wineries as Asti, Souverain, Sonoma Wine Company, and Lambert as wine chemist and enologist. And 14 years ago, we were lucky enough to have her join Scott Labs as our finding expert. We ran some numbers the other day and calculated that since starting in the wine industry, she's run thousands of trials. That's a lot. As I've said before, wine is not a simple beverage with all the positives fermenting grapes bring to the consumer. There are also tools we need to utilize as producers to make it enjoyable. And today we're talking Bentonite. This presentation is a foundational one I hope you will feel you can return to as a continual reference on how to deal with grape proteins. Maggie is going to touch on a lot of what's, whys, and hows. Some crucial takeaways will be that as you should know your Bentonites, know how to hydrate them, and know that bench top trials are a very, very key part of this process. During the talk, I'll be posting several quick polls. Please feel free to fill them out. They're fun. After the talk, we'll have some time for questions and answers. Some quick webinar tips though. Make sure you can see the audio settings on the lower left and along the bottom, the raise hand, the Q&A buttons. There's also a chat button. These will be the main channels for communication. Mainly the Q&A buttons will be your place where if you have any questions or comments, go ahead and make them. As usual, if you have any questions that occur during the talk, use that button and we'll try and answer the questions after the presentation. Your questions will be anonymous. I'll also be looking for raised hands if you'd like to ask your questions live. There's a survey afterwards. Please fill that out as we like to continually improve on these webinars. And just so you know, we'll be recording this webinar. We'll be making it available soon after today. I've said this before. Sometimes it can feel with winemaking, we're herding cats. In today's case, we're just showing you how to use a little bit of catnip. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over the microphone to Maggie McBride. Maggie?
Hi, Darren. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm just going to correct one little thing. I was actually never an enologist or lab director with any of the Beringer Souverain companies, just to clear that up because it seemed—
Oh yeah, sorry guys, yeah.
That's okay. It wasn't until I came to Scott Laboratories that I became their wine lab director. And I've always loved playing with wine and improving it from both a sensory or physiochemical aspect. And the problems that plagued me while working at various facilities early on in my career still plague our winemakers today. One of those is wine stability. And when I say stability, I mean overall stability: tartrate, color, colloidal, and heat stability. For today's focus, we're going to talk specifically on Bentonite as it pertains to heat stability in white rosé wines. So I've had such a long road with Bentonite. Its ability to protein heat stabilize our wine, I feel like, gets taken for granted. And if we're really going to understand how Bentonite works in our wine and what its role is in protein stability, we really need to better understand Bentonite. So here's what we're going to cover today: the charge and the mechanism for absorption, the structure and hydration, whether your Bentonite is sodium or calcium based, and how that sodium or calcium based Bentonite is different in how they impact stability. Then we're going to dive into two of my favorite Bentonites from Erbsloh, which we are now carrying. Erbsloh is a German company that's been doing Bentonite for a very long time. And I think we're really lucky to be carrying them because they have created some Bentonites that deal with a very specific wine logistics and cellar logistics. They've created two Bentonites. So let's move on. So what is Bentonite and what does Bentonite do for us? First of all, it's a clay, right? So you can use it for general clarification. I like it for protein heat stability haze because it really is the only finding agent that is really effective at pulling out protein. And so I don't know what everybody's background is, but protein in wine, when it gets heated up, it can precipitate out and cause a very ugly haze. So if you're sending your wine to Texas, you do not want your wine to be hazy when it gets trucked through all the heat and sits in warehouse. You're typically going to be using this in the final blend. You don't want to protein stabilize portion of your lot and then blend it with another protein stabilized portion. Blending those two portions can mess with the wine matrix and create an instability. So you really want to use this for protein stabilization at the very end of winemaking, unless you're using our cool Fermobent product. Then we'll talk about that. So let me think for a second. So I want to talk about why I'm so passionate about this, right? So we took a pretty huge shift in tartrate stability. Maybe it was 2010, where some products that were not legal in our industry became legal. I'm speaking specifically of CMC, carboxymethylcellulose gum, and Clarstar. These are tartrate crystal inhibitors that you add to your wine to prevent tartrate dropout. Now, the one thing that you need to be mindful of is that if you use these products, your wine has to be protein stable because those products are going to react with protein. And this is where I really started caring more about Bentonite. I always cared before because we did a lot of heat stabs in our service lab, but now we're carrying a product, Clarstar. And I really need to be able to talk to clients and help them understand why it's so imperative that their wines get protein stable. So this really is one of the things that drove me to seek knowledge and understand how Bentonite works better. Working in that lab with my team, our team, the Scott Lab team, I got to see a ton of different Bentonites come in. And the coolest thing is everybody that I asked to submit a sample of their cellar Bentonite would typically submit one. And that's because I had explained to them, look, Bentonites are very absorptive in nature. If I try to do a heat stability test with, even if it's the same brand of Bentonite that I have of your Bentonite here in my lab, it may not react the same. And that's because your cellar conditions are different than my lab. And so that could change the Bentonite ever so slightly enough to where it could theoretically impact dose rates. What I'd get in the lab might not be exactly what you'll need in the cellar. So through this time, we'd receive tons of different Bentonites and we'd hydrate them and swell them. And I'd get online and look at all the tech sheets, and I started realizing, gosh, this takes a really long time to swell well. This doesn't. This is behaving really differently. And I'll be honest, at that point, my background in the lab was always protein stability. So we always used a Bentonite in most of the facilities that I worked at that was really good at protein, pulling out protein. So some of the other Bentonites I really didn't care about. But once you start playing with them and dabbling with them, you can see here's a Bentonite right here, kind of dirty, right? Kind of fluffy. This Bentonite in the middle, if you can see on the right side of your screen, this Bentonite in the middle is a little bit clarified with a little fluff, and this Bentonite over to the right is even more clarified up on top where the water is, but super compact on the bottom. And you can see conversely, they behave differently in wine. So this is a cool thing to know and understand. And from my conversations talking to clients on the phone, they don't know. Somebody just told them to use this bentonite, so they're going to use it, but they have no idea why they were told. All right, so let's get into the meat of my talk. We're going to talk about, this next section is going to be all about the things that I think are important for you to understand about bentonite. So negatively charged, clay, the lattice structure, it absorbs things. You've got sodium or calcium-based bentonite, and you need water to hydrate it. You can't use it dry, and it's going to behave differently in hard water. All right, so let's keep moving along. So when in solution, why does negatively charged bentonite bind with protein? Well, wine proteins have an isoelectric point that lies between a pH of 3 and 3.5. In wine, this will bear a net positive charge. Woohoo, what do we know about opposites? They attract. Here we've got Miss Protein over here on the left. She's sassy. Mr. Bentonite is a little straight-laced and dapper, but they definitely attract each other. And, you know, like in love, if it were only this simple, they could get together and flocculate to the bottom of your tank. But like in love, for these two to get together, a lot of factors need to line up correctly. So we're going to dive into what those factors are, and we're going to look at the physical structure of bentonite, the water used to swell or hydrate the bentonite. The timing of that is also important, and whether your bentonite sodium or calcium based. So you're going to see that I'm going to repeat a lot of these things again and again throughout our talk, and that's because these are the things that I talk about daily with clients who call in. I get phone calls, Maggie, I used bentonite, it didn't work. What do you mean it didn't work? I don't know. I just put it in my wine. Well, did you hydrate it? Yes. Did you hydrate it for the right amount of time? I think so. How long did you hydrate it for? Maybe an hour? Okay. And how much water did you use? Enough to get it wet. That's not the way we need to be using bentonite, and we'll get into that later. And remember, we want this product to pull out protein if that's what we're using it for. So to do that, this lattice structure needs to be completely open. You open it by hydrating it. That allows these little negatively charged open lattices to be binding sites for positive protein. The openness of the lattice structure correlates to the availability of the bentonite to bind to protein. I hope this is all making sense. Great, how do we get it to do that? And what is going to inhibit that magnetic availability of the binding sites on the bentonite lattice? Once again, the structure, the hydration, and whether your bentonite is sodium or calcium based. We're gonna go into the hydration part right now. When we receive our bentonite, as we all know, it comes in a bag, big bag of dirt. I really like dirt. I don't talk about this much at Scott Labs, but I almost minored in geology, and I was an only child growing up till I was about 8. And so I played a lot with dirt and rocks and my stuffed toy animals. So I do love bentonite. And when we get it, it's not ready for wine. It's not ready to do its thing for us. The structure is flat. It's uninhabitable. It's dry. And it's not open to do the job we need it to do. So what do? There's our tight lattice pre-hydration structure over here on the left. Here's our water structure, or here's our water, and here's our timer so that we can hydrate for the appropriate amount of time. If you use the appropriate amount of water for the appropriate amount of time, follow your manufacturer spec sheet, tech sheet, then you will open your lattice as open as it can be to do its job. If you don't do this, then you're not getting the best protein removal from your bentonite, period. So I'm gonna holler this at you again, because sometimes I feel like when I talk to some of my most beloved clients, they just don't want to hear it. And I get it. I've been there. I've been in a cellar. I've had to write the work orders. I know we're up against bottling deadlines. But there are no shortcuts to get your bentonite to work properly. You need to follow the user guidelines. I know it sounds like I'm banging and yelling at you, and I don't mean to, but it's well, what if I don't do it, Maggie? Well, then don't do it, but you've wasted a lot of time. Look, if you're doing a 4 pound per 1,000 gallon ad and you've got 20 to 120,000 gallons, that's a lot of bentonite to be hauling around the cellar. You've got to get enough water in there, and you've got to pump all that, and then you've got to let it sit. And if you cut all those steps in half, you've just wasted an enormous amount of time, because you may have to repeat the process. Now, I know there are some facilities that don't care about protein stability and it's not important. They're willing to risk it. But that's not who I'm talking to right now. Here's an example of our Blanco Bent UF, 8 to 12 times its volume in the water, right? That's a lot of water, 4 times 8 if you're doing a 4 pounds per 1,000 gallons. And then you're gonna stir it. You're gonna let it sit for 30 to 60 minutes. Then you're gonna stir it again. And then you're gonna let it swell for 6 to 12 hours. Some people wanna shortcut that. They wanna do it for 4. Okay, then you are going to sacrifice that open lattice structure. Keep that in mind. And you may have to repeat the process. I hate repeating the process. So that's why I followed the directions. So once you do that properly, look at that. Lattice structures wide open. These little yellow arrows are our Sauvignon Blanc or our Viognier, and it can get in there, and those negative binding sites can bind to positive protein. Okay, what if you're using sodium bentonite? What if you're using calcium-based bentonite? Well, they're very different. They behave differently. Sodium bentonite is got a very loose lattice structure. It has a high dispersion rate, and it's gonna settle out fluffy. This can cause a problem with racking. I know. We want a tight, compact settling so that we can rack off cleanly. You don't always get that with sodium. Calcium, on the other hand, will settle much more compact, and that's because it's got 2 times the charge density as sodium. So its lattice structures are charged closely together. They're very tight. Oftentimes you'll see in the industry a blend of these two, so you get the benefit of both these bentonites. And so there is a difference, however, on the way these two bentonites hydrate. So back to a similar picture that we've already seen, our pre-tight lattice structure over here, pre-hydration, water plus time, and then over on the right, everything's hydrated and as open as it can be. And you can see over on the right, the calcium just never opens up as much as the sodium. And so it's never going to be able to pull out or get at as much protein in your wine as the sodium-based bentonite can. Calcium also behaves very differently in hard water. So this is a snippet from our Erbsloh brochure that they shared with us. And you can see over here, what you're looking at is you're looking at bentonite swelled in hard water. So here's the deal. Calcium never swells well at all. And then if you put it in hard water, it's really not going to swell well. And so you'll see under each cylinder, you'll see 14 degrees DH. And DH is degree of water hardness. So if we look at the calcium Ca granulant, that's over on the very left, you'll see that at the same dose rate, there's at 0 degrees of hard water, it definitely swells better. So 14 degrees hard water, compact, 0 degrees hard water, little fluffy and swell. And then here, let me put my cursor on it, what I'm talking about. And then here's the 5 degrees hard water, better swelling, but okay, here's our 1% tartaric acid model wine solution, totally compact. So if you go ahead and you look in the middle, you'll see our Nacolette Portec bentonite. That's a sodium calcium ben. And so you'll see That has better swellability than the calcium bentonite in hard water. And then if you come all the way over to the right, we've got Granubent Portec, our sodium-based bentonite. And look at that, in all the different degrees of hard water, you've got, sorry, my cell phone's buzzing. It's Scott Labs calling me all day, even when I'm meeting. So 14 degrees hard water with sodium granubent, everything's swelling nicely, even in the 1% tartaric acid solution. So that's pretty cool. So takeaway to this is, if you are using bentonite for protein stability and you have hard water, you need to be using a sodium-based bentonite, or at the very least a blend, and just realize hard water does affect the swellability of bentonite. So sodium calcium conclusion: sodium's lighter, fluffier lattice structure. When properly hydrated, it's going to open the widest. You're going to have more contact with the wine, therefore more protein to be absorbed. If you've got hard water, use sodium. Calcium, because of that different charge, tight charge. Calcium has got a tighter lattice structure than sodium when it's fully hydrated, and it's not as good at removing protein. And you will sacrifice compaction if you use sodium-based bentonite. So just be mindful of that. Next, let's talk about some problems with using bentonite. Bentonite's mined from the earth. It's a natural product. It can be a source of heavy metals. Heavy metals are not good for anybody, and they can also leach out and shed some color on your wine. And so this is not good. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later in the talk. But there are legal limits to hard metals in our wine. They need to be very low. And then also it's a raw material, and so it can be very inconsistent, especially where it's mined from. Typical protein stabilization takes time and tank space. This is the part that I hate the most, that woman banging her head against the desk down in the bottom. That's me. That's me, because I used to work for this awesome winemaker, and she made one of the most lovely Viogniers I've ever had. And one time she told me, don't get married to those aromatics. Half of this lot's gonna get shipped. So we're gonna bentonite it. And I was like, oh, no, we worked so hard in the vineyard. We worked so hard during harvest. We've aged it nicely. It's just beautiful. And now we know, because it's a high protein varietal, that we're going to beat it down with some bentonite, right? We're going to strip some of those flavors and aromatics, because bentonite absorbs those things. Very sad. And of course, the bench trials are always necessary. They do take time. They take expertise, and they take a lab. So whether you're doing them yourself, they're going to take time. Whether you're sending them off to a service lab, then you have to wait for the results. Also, bentonite deactivates enzymes. So enzymes are protein. Bentonite binds with protein. So if you're, and we're using bentonite oftentimes in the final part of our winemaking process as the final blend. And oftentimes we want to use filtration enzymes like Scottzyme KS. So you need to think about when you're going to add those and when you're going to add bentonite. Don't add them at the same time. They counteract each other. I would say, once your blend's together, totally together, Scottzyme KS it, give it a week. Think about your tank temperature when you're giving it a week. Maybe you can get away with it in 3 days. And then go ahead and start your protein stabilization process. So when we're using bentonite, here are the key things to keep in mind. Store the bentonite properly, because it is absorbative in nature. It's going to absorb moisture. It's going to absorb odors. If you've got a stinky cellar, an older cellar, I've worked in some really older cellars that are stinky, and that happens. Don't put the bentonite in there. It's going to just suck all that up. Your swell time and appropriate water volume is a must to open the lattice structure. If you don't do it, you're just, oh, what's going on here? I don't know if you guys are seeing that. We'll get rid of that. And then understand the differences between bentonite, sodium or calcium. How's that going to impact what are my winemaking goals? How's that going to impact? And then understand that bentonite is lighter, fluffier, and you're going to sacrifice some compaction. Or do a trial with a blended bentonite, get the best of both worlds. And then know your water hardness. See, I'm repeating myself. This is because I repeat myself a lot on the phone with my clients. And then timing when you use enzymes. Awesome. All the puzzle pieces have been put together. All right, so we've covered the meat of our bentonite topic today, all the things that I think are important to understand. Next, we're going to go into our Erbsloh bentonites. So let's get on the ball with that. Time, everybody. Okay, why Erbsloh? Like I said, Erbsloh has been doing it for a long time, 125 years. They are a German company, and they have developed very specialized bentonites to deal with very specific problems in the cellar. They work with the University of Geisenheim and other companies like Paul Food Corporation to drive innovation. And their bentonites are really cool. I've played with all of them in the lab. They're granulated, they go into water easily, they're very pure, there's a lot less dust, and they're fabulous for juice. We're going to talk a little bit about juice fining, but for this, in juice fining, you can get some good results with juice fining, and you can use a lot of different bentonites for that. But for this talk, we're actually going to dive into the concept of talking about fermenting on the bentonite. So we'll develop that a little bit later. But the other reason that I love Erbsloh is their QC and compliance. They are so transparent. They have really tight specs. They list those specs, and they have all the necessary compliance documents. They do a really good job. So let's talk about their specs. Look at this. This is cool. So the OIV is the European regulatory body. And if we're looking at aluminum, you can see in bentonite, there's maybe about 100 grams per kg. The soluble proportion of that is 2%. The OIV threshold is 2.5 grams per kilogram. But in Erbsloh bentonites, they stay way below that, about 0.1 to 0.2 grams per kilogram. And that trend kind of goes down through this column. Calcium, the OIV threshold, 5 grams per kg. Erbsloh's 1 to 4. Iron, nobody likes iron in their wine. It's gonna turn your wine pink. 600 milligrams per kg is acceptable, but Erbsloh bentonites only have 30 to 90 milligrams per kg. They try and keep it within those specs. Arsenic, we've all talked about arsenic in our industry, 2 milligrams per kg. OIV threshold value, Erbsloh's is 0.1 to 0.8. Lead, 5 milligrams per kg. Erbsloh is 0.9 to 1.8. So you can see their specs are really tight. And this means that you're going to get a much more consistent product, a much more pure product, something you can take to the bank with you. You can rely on it. All right, so my 2 favorite bentonites that Erbsloh makes is Fermobent. It's for harvest for the juice phase, 1-step protein stabilization during fermentation, and you can preserve your aromatics. And then in the wine phase, you can use Blanco Bent, 1-step protein stabilization during crossflow filtration. What? No. For years we've been told there is no bentonite ever allowed near our crossflow filter. We do not want to gum up those membranes. We don't want to scratch them. We don't want to break them. Well, like I said, Erbsloh is pretty cool. They got together with Paul, another German company. They're just across the river from each other. And they said, hey, Paul Food and Beverage Corporation, let's develop a bentonite that can go through crossflow. What specs does it need to meet? So they did. And we'll get into those specs a little bit later. First, I want to step into the world of harvest and fermenting on the bentonite. What this means, this does not mean fining. This does not mean fining on the juice phase. This means actually pitching this stuff in, adding your yeast and nutrients, and going to ferment. You can accomplish a lot with this. I was very skeptical when when this first came on, because I'm a lab rat. I'm skeptical of everything. I like to prove it. And it wasn't until I talked to a client on the East Coast who I believe she's fermenting Gruner Veltliner, and she'd actually been using this bentonite a lot longer than we'd been carrying it, and she schooled me on how to use it properly. So she said she would never make high protein varietals that are fermented in tank without this product, and she was so happy that we were carrying it. So if you use the appropriate amount of this product, you can actually come out of fermentation with a protein stable wine. This is a sodium calcium based bentonite. So you're getting the best of both worlds. That also comes with a much bigger add of this bentonite, which I know is going to freak some of us out. Let's keep moving on here. So if you're going to go down the road of fermenting on bentonite, clean bentonite is key for fermentation, right? You can see over on the right, that is what I consider our typical industry standard bentonite. It's very fluffy. It looks like dirt and water and mud. And then over on the left is actually our Fermobent. So you can see it's much lighter in a color, and it's just a very different bentonite. There's absolutely no, it's as pure as it can be. And purity for fermentation purposes is really key. So this is kind of my mantra. Remember, not all bentonites are the same. If we were to ferment on the bentonite to the far left, that's kind of a pinkish color, and that pinkish color suggests to me that it's got some iron in it. Oh, what would that do to your Sauv Blanc? Pink and Sauv Blanc, not so good. Is it okay for rosé? I don't want to find out. The middle bentonite kind of, and these are hard to see, the color. The middle bentonite kind of has a green tinge, which suggests copper-based bentonite. Do we want to forget bent on copper? No. Could you imagine fermenting on a copper-based bentonite that in your rosé? That would be a really ugly color if it leached out. So the key for fermenting on bentonite is clean, clean, clean bentonite, which we know Erbsloh can supply. They've been doing it for 125 years. They have those tight specs that they need to meet. And so just not all bentonites are the same. Okay, so when is it appropriate to ferment on bentonite? And when to do it and how to do it. So in the heat of harvest, are you going to do a heat stability trial? Maybe if you're at a really big facility, I know some of them do that, and that's fine, you can. Most of the places I've worked at, we don't have time for that. There is too much going on, and there's never enough hands in the cellar to get it all done, and the lab and all the incoming juice analysis. So what do? Will we just guess at it? I hope not. Hopefully, if you are looking at protein stabilizing your wine, then you have some past data to go from. Also consider the varietal that you're using. Is it going to be a tank fermented Chardonnay? Then it's not going to need as much as something like a Viognier or Sauv Blanc. You're still going to have to swell this bentonite in the appropriate amount of water for the appropriate amount of time. And yes, those dose rates are higher, 4 to 12 pounds per 1,000 gallons. When I saw that for the first time, I was like, no, I'm not comfortable with that. I cannot tell a client to do that. But thankfully, my client on the East Coast, or I should say our client on the East Coast, was very kind and reassured me that she's been doing it for years and it's not a problem. And of course, if you think about it, Erbsloh is from Germany. Those Germans, they have all those high protein varietals, and they've been doing this for about 10 years without any negative impacts. It wouldn't be such a good cellar if it was going to be a problem with those high dose rates. So let's kind of go over some scenarios with using Fermoblant. So a tale of two wines, Sauv Blanc versus Chardonnay. Sauv Blanc, tank fermented and tank aged. It's a high protein varietal. I'm going to say start at 6 pounds per 1,000 gallons, 6 to 8. You know, I think it was the 2009 vintage. I can't remember. No, maybe it was 2005. I started Scott Labs in 2006. And it was around that time, within a year or 2 years. Like I said, I've been there for 14 years, so things kind of get all mumbled jumbled. But a lot of wines from Dry Creek Valley were coming in at that time with the need for something like a 13 pound per 1,000 gallon dose of Bentonite, Sauv Blancs from Dry Creek Valley. So, you know, there's a little hint. So maybe I do need to go 10 to 12 pounds if it's that type of year. It's a tough call. A juice trial would be beneficial in determining it. If we're talking about Chardonnay, barrel fermented and aged, is Ferment appropriate for that? I don't know. I talked to our rep at Erbsloh, and really it's probably not necessary because you're fermenting in the barrel and you're aging in the barrel. And wine that has contact with the lees in the barrel has manna proteins. Those manna proteins confer tartrate, heat, color, and colloidal stability over time. And we want to age on those lees. Well, we don't want bentonite mucked in those lees while we're aging in the barrel, because bentonite's just going to bind with those manna proteins and you're not going to get anything good out of it. Could you theoretically ferment on bentonite in barrel? Yes, you could, and then rack off your lees and substitute with a product like Noblesse. Yes, it's possible. I don't know if I'd want to do it. You know, if I had extra time on my hand and an extra lot to play around with and do a trial, that might be fun. But if you're going to do tank fermented and aged Chardonnay, then it's a low protein varietal compared to Sauv Blanc and Viognier. So maybe start at 4 pounds per 1,000 gallons. So concerns about fermenting on the must. Okay, so I've read some literature where it was theorized that the bentonite could absorb the nutrients, the must nutrients that help our yeast do the best fermentation that they can do. Erbsloh did a 2-year study and saw no impact on nutrient load and problems with fermentation. Client feedback from people who've been doing it for a long time have not reported that. The Virginia Wine Research Association, they did a trial and did not, to my knowledge, report that there was any issues with nutrient load. Heavy metals are something to be concerned with. Of course, here we have our pink bentonite over on the left in the bottom of this slide, and our copper. So that is something to be mindful of, but if you're using Ferment, you don't have to worry about that, because Erbsloh is going to make sure that that bentonite is as pure as it needs to be to ferment on. And the reason we need to use more bentonite than if we were just juice fining is because it's a sodium calcium based blend bentonite, right? So to get that protein removal, we got to use a little more of something that has some calcium blended in it. But we need that calcium in there so that when we're done with fermentation and we want to rack off of the ferment, everything compacts really nicely down. Now, in the juice phase, I love enzymes. Enzymes are another favorite product of mine because I hate problem filtrations and I hate wines that won't settle. So if you are going to be using enzymes on your juice, go ahead and bring your juice in. Go ahead, add your fining agents to bring down some solids if you do that. Add your enzymes, and then go ahead and let that do. Everybody's got different ideas on settling time. I hear 8 hours to 24 hours. Then go ahead and rack off, and then add your bentonite with your nutrients in your yeast. You don't want to add the enzymes with your bentonite. They're just gonna counteract each other, as I've already talked about. Okay, so we've covered that. Let's pop into Blanco Bent UF. one-step protein stabilization and filtration. This is fantastic. I used to work at a custom crush facility and custom bottling facility, and wines were supposed to come to us protein and cold stable. Guess what? They'd get there and they did not meet the specs. Now we're up against a bottling deadline. We've got the bottling line manager. He wants his wine. He wants it in the bottle. They want to get it out to market. We've got clients that need to fill the grocery store. It is imperative that we get this wine in the bottle. Now we've got to wait to do a Bentonite ad, and we've got to wait for it to settle out. And the bigger the volume of wine tank, we've got to find tank space for it, yada, 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 yada. So Erbsloh, like I said, got together with Paul, Food and Beverage Corporation, and they designed this Bentonite to work with their Erbsloh crossflow. So here's our crossflow filtration, and here is on the left, and then over on the right, we've got our two Bentonites. On the far right is our industry standard Bentonite. On the left is that very fine powder looking Bentonite, and that is the type of Bentonite that is it's safe enough to go through your crossflow filtration. Why is that? Well, there's no sand grit in it. It's a sodium-based Bentonite with no sand grit. It's got a particle size that's smaller than 100 microns. You're still gonna have to swell it and use the right amount of water to swell. But the way this works, and it's pretty cool if you can pull it off, let me back up. So see how, let's go back to that last slide because I really like how big this is. See how fine this is? This is not gonna settle out well in your wine. Whereas the far left powdery looking Bentonite is not gonna settle out well in your wine. It's gonna actually stay up in solution. I had a client call me, say, Maggie, I used Blanco Bent UF. It's been in there for a week and a half. It won't drop out. And I said, oh, I thought to myself, do you not remember? Did you not read the tech sheet? This is not supposed to settle out. It's supposed to stay in solution. And he was like, oh, that's right. I said, yeah, so keep your tank mixing and go through crossflow. It's kind of cool the way this works. So on the crossflow membrane, sometimes as we're filtering a wine, a gel layer builds up over time, and that can slow our filtration down. The particle size is small enough that it doesn't damage, and it's soft enough that it doesn't damage the membrane, but what it actually does is it etches away at that gel layer forming on those hollow fiber membranes, and it actually can increase the speed of your fermentation. One of our sales reps, Luke, has a client who reported back that he was so impressed with the speed of his crossflow filtration. And hey, man, when you're getting ready to bottle and you've got that bottling truck coming, or you've got a bottling line and their manager that wants their wine ready to go now, that speed and ease of filtration is really something. It's pretty fantastic. Concerns about Blanco Bent UF, of course, timing of enzymes. I kind of touched on this. If you're going to be using your filtration aid, there is an appropriate time. I would say about 3 days to a week before you add your Blanco Bent UF. The Bentonite Blanco Bent needs to be in solution. Don't let it settle. Clumps of Bentonite and pumps and membranes are not good. You're going to stop everything. We don't want that. Speak with your crossflow filter manufacturer. I know we've got clients who have Deltavolas using this. I think we've got a client that has a Patavan crossflow filter that's using this. This was designed with Paul Food and Beverage Corporation for the Erbsloh crossflow filter, so we know it works really well with this. And then make sure you're using the correct pump. And if you do decide to go down this route, please contact me and I'll put you in touch with our service department. Our service guys are phenomenal, and they can kind of help you go through your setup and make sure you have all the right pieces of equipment to make sure you are successful at crossflow filtering Bentonite. So here's why I love Erbsloh, right? They actually have solved some of the bigger problems that we see with other bentonites. They've got the tight specs. They create a very consistent bentonite that you can rely on getting the same thing again and again and again. And then they have minimized the amount of tank space and time that you need for protein stabilization, whether you're doing fermentation in the juice phase and fermenting on bentonite, or whether you are heading up against a bottling deadline and you need to protein stabilize some wine. Both of these bentonites, Fermobent and Blancobent, definitely solve those problems. And those are the problems that I think we all just, we've got to do this. We've got to get it done. We all can relate to. So now you know why I love bentonite. It is more than just dirt. It is one of the coolest things we have available to us to protein stabilize our wine. Yes, there are other fining agents or tannins that can have an effect on protein stabilization, but really it's bentonite that's doing the bulk of the work of protein stabilization for us. And I just want to thank you all for your time. I know that was a lot to take into. I love being dirty. As you can see in this picture, this is my first harvest. And like, if you can't get dirty playing with wine and dirt, why bother? And if you have any questions, you can contact us. I'm going to hand it over to Darren now. Darren?
Wow, that was awesome. Thank you.
Oh,
can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Hey, good.
Hey.
Good. There was some clicking. I don't know what that was from about, but I don't know what. But anyways, yeah, no, that was awesome. We've got some pretty good questions. I just threw up one more poll. And after we're done with the Q&A section, I can share you some of the polling results.
Okay.
But yeah, no, that was really, really cool. So we got a couple of questions.
Shoot.
And go ahead. Sorry.
I said go for it.
Okay, cool. So here's the first one, which I don't know. Now go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and ask you some of these questions, and sometimes they'll be, a little open or not, but here's a good one. I think it's very applicable to what's going on. What happens if you exceed the 12 hours for swelling process? What is the concern for that?
Well, there's not. That's not a big deal. It's just a range, but don't go under it. So if it says 10 to 12 hours, don't go under 10. It's okay to go over 12. But look, I just talked to somebody and they said, hey, can I swell my bentonite and leave it for a week? Yeah, you can. You don't want
Are you worried about, is there any worry about contamination or growth, or there's no concern about that at all?
I mean, I've been in a lot of different cellars. There are some cellars that I think you could get away with that. There are some cellars I would not do that. Remember, like water solution sitting around a week, your cellar operation, I wouldn't do it more than 2 weeks. I wouldn't even do it a week, but my background's in a lab, so it's easy for me to say that, right? I think a week is plenty. Yeah, there's no straightforward answer to that, but 12 hours is fine. Next.
I mean, at least the minimum. So we got to do at least. I mean, it's got to be a fair enough amount of time, which goes into another question, which is kind of interesting. I actually looked this up. Someone's using a bentonite called Albumex. I had to look that up, and and
albumin.
Funny. It says that is direct application calcium bentonite preparation for clarification and protein stabilization. Granulated formula dissolved instantly in cold water, no mixing, settling, or wetting. Add directly to your wine. What do you think about that? Is odds are that's not going to really do much? I mean, the hydration portion of bentonite, that is a significant part of it.
I don't know. I haven't looked at it and I haven't played with it. So the way to find out is to take something that needs something that that works well, and then do a trial against it. and see if you really get the protein removal that you want to get.
Okay, yeah, so it goes back to the trial thing.
It does. It does.
Yeah.
And heck, if I could have access to our lab, but we're in COVID times, so.
Yeah. And then this is kind of a combo question. Somebody asked if there's any chemical hazards that their quality folks need to be aware of, considering HACCP or food safety plans. And then also combined with that, there was somebody that said, if a material has heavy metals, the bentonite has heavy metals, what effect does the dose and the process step in which bentonite is added? What does that have an effect on the wine? So it's a two-parter. I mean, one, do we need to worry about that kind of stuff? And two, if we do, what kind of impact could it potentially have?
I think when I would worry about it is when I'm buying a bentonite that's not going to give me certificates of conformity or certificates of analysis that proves that they meet regulatory guidelines. Because if you're in those guidelines, then you don't have those issues. But, I talk to people and, I had one guy, he's like, well, heck, there's a bentonite mine right next door to me. He's like, I'll just go get bentonite from there. I was like, well, it hasn't been refined. It hasn't been filtered out. You don't know what's in there. So yeah, I think that's the thing to look at. And, nowadays with traceability, everybody's got to have certificates of analysis. We can get deeper into metal content and reactivity, but that's kind of a bigger subject. And I can't get into that too much here because I don't have a great background, but I know it's bad. Metal in wine is not good.
No, yeah.
There's a couple things that can happen.
Do you have any idea how long the reaction of bentonite and protein takes? Is it instantaneous?
It's pretty instantaneously. So in the lab, it's so funny, I worked at so many different places and they had different standard operating procedures for bentonite finding. And you can do it. It's pretty intense. At least on a bench scale trial, it's pretty reactive right then and there. Now, in a tank, are you mixing it thoroughly? The key is getting it mixed thoroughly and waiting for it to settle if you're not using something like Blanco Bent. So Blanco Bent works because, yes, it is a very reactive, it happens almost instantaneously. But in Blanco Bent UF, that bentonite, there's a collection vessel. This is going to be kind of long-winded. And so the collection vessel of the permeate is also getting that's got some of the bentonite. It's getting a lot of contact with the wine, the bentonite that you added in. And so, yeah, it's pretty instantaneous, but if you're using bentonite in the standard procedure, large volume of wine and temperature, all those things, and waiting for settling, that's the problem.
What's your feeling about as far as finding somebody's using some isinglass about 2 hours before adding sodium bentonite, and they allow about 5 to 6 days before racking off. Is there any reactivity with the isinglass directly? My understanding is bentonite kind of just works mostly on the larger grape proteins, not so much. Is there any interaction with those smaller proteins?
No, high molecular weight proteins and low molecular weight. I would never do the two in conjunction. I just wouldn't. Protein is protein. Bentonite, yes, you probably find. I've seen it done. It just doesn't make sense to me. And if you're doing this, have you done bench trials? And what were the results of your bench trials? I would want to see that. If you're doing it and your wine's coming out protein stable, then I guess you're fine.
What do you think about? I mean, I don't see why not. But why couldn't you use Blanco Bent with something other than a crossflow filter? I mean, there's no downside.
Because it doesn't settle out really well. So
okay.
You need something to help it settle out.
Could you use
like Gelocol?
Okay.
Like a silica gel. Yeah.
Okay.
You could.
Thoughts on protein stabilization in red wines with bentonite, especially unoaked reds?
So tannins and proteins tend to hang out together. So if you're going to protein stabilize your red wine, you're going to pull some of those tannins out. So we don't typically see it. You might, if you did something like a 1/4 pound per 1,000 and you wanted to pull some unstable proteins out, I guess it'd be okay. I just feel like depending upon the varietal, like I wouldn't attempt to do it in Pinot. It's very delicate varietal that causes us all sorts of headaches. It's very touchy, very finicky. If it's a heavy cab, I guess, why are you doing it? What is going on that you want to add bentonite to a red wine? What do you?
I mean, I know by volume, there's a lot of people that do. I mean, I know I used to work at a very large winery, and we hate stabilize all the reds and whites. I will say that they usually do that near the end, and having a discussion about glycosidase activity in applications in reds, it was brought up because glycosidase activity is a kind of anthocyanase, so you could potentially destabilize some color pigments if you use that. That being said, the concern drops dramatically if there's enough time between the end of fermentation and processing that the colors have stabilized. So, I mean, like anecdotally, I haven't, seen too much color, loss from heat stabilizing of reds. But again, that's usually typically one of the last stages to do. These are also folks that cold stabilize as well. So all the fining and everything is done before that. So typically by then we didn't really see much of an effect. And then here's another question. Is Fermobent as effective as an adjuvant during the flotation process to help compact the top leaves? What do you think about that? Do you recommend a different bentonite? I mean, I know working with flotation, I've seen a lot of Erbsloh bentonites used during flotation.
So we recommend granubent and nacolite for that. Those are the two bentonites for flotation when I spoke to the rep last year about that. And I'll be honest, I have to look back at my notes. I don't remember exactly why, but Fermobent is not the best bentonite for that application. The granubent would be a better bentonite for that application.
Oh, okay. And I'm going to try and answer these or offer these questions up in line. So we do have a verbal question from Tracy. Tracy, did you have a question? You have to unmute, Tracy.
I'd like a little more clarification about the timing and use of nanoproteins for cold stability versus using a bentonite.
Okay, so, and that, I kind of glossed over that. So nanoproteins are used for tartrate stability, but to use those for tartrate stability, you need to protein stabilize so if you add a nanoprotein to an unstable protein wine matrix, you could just exacerbate that instability. Does that make sense?
I think so. Tracy, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Oh, good. It's a good question. We talk about tartrate stability and heat stability, and sometimes they get a little confusing. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? So it was a good question.
Okay, so how about barrel fermented Chardonnay? What bentonite would you recommend for heat stability and clarity of compacting leaves?
So for just finding the juice?
No, it just looks like for barrel fermented Chardonnay. Once it's done and it's been in barrel, is there anyone that you would recommend?
Once it's done.
That would both, once it's done, it appears, yeah.
So I would do this in the final blend when you rack off, and that would actually, if you don't have access to crossflow and you don't want to use Blanco bent, then granubent, that's our sodium-based bentonite for protein stability. If it's been aged in barrels, you might get away with a gentler bentonite, nacolite, so that's the sodium-calcium blend, and so you're going to have to do bench trials to determine which one is going to best work with your fermented barrel Chardonnay.
Okay.
And keep in mind, you have hard water. So if you have hard water, you could still get away with the nacolite, but protein stability is really your shtick. If it's not as protein, it should be coming off of barrel aging, it should be getting close to protein. So you could do a trial and determine whether you're going to use Nacolite or Granubent.
Okay, so we are coming up to 12 o'clock. So thank you again for those of you who have to leave. Thanks for the time. I really do appreciate it. We have a lot of questions though, so we still have a lot of questions. So I'm going to go ahead and do the outro. Here's some of the polling results just for you guys that are still there. Here's some results from the first poll. Most of you use Bentonites after fermentation. And then for types of bentonite, we do mostly, it looks like mostly sodium bentonite, or you don't know. That was the two prominent answers to that question. The last poll was heat stability testing. Do you confirm your wine is heat stable after adding bentonite? By far, 70% said yes, they do. Some said no, and some said I don't test heat stability. So that's pretty consistent to that. And I really want to stress, thank you guys for coming again. We're going to continue with these questions, but I just wanted to shout out for folks that had stuck here until the end. Don't forget, we are going to have a survey afterwards. Please fill that out. Thank you again for your time. I can't stress that enough. And please submit the survey and introduce some topics, because we are basing our upcoming topics on your comments. So keep them coming. And don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or any other comments, because we do believe in continual improvement. For those of you who have to leave, my email is darrenm@scottlabs.com, darrenm@scottlab.com. That's not plural. And we post the webinars on our website. So you just have to Google Scott Labs webinars. It should show up in the search results. It's probably the easiest way, honestly, to find it. It's just Google Scott Labs webinars or Scott Lab webinars. And thank you again for all that you've come. We really do want to wish you guys healthy families and very, very much happiness. So if you have time, Maggie, do you want to continue with some of these questions? We can even do a lightning round if so be it. Okay, so for any of you guys that are left hanging out, we're going to go ahead and continue these questions. And then don't hesitate. If you do run out of time, you got to leave. We totally understand. Thank you so much for coming. It's been really fun. Thank you, Maggie. And don't hesitate to email us those questions, because we'll try and respond. Of course, you can always call in at Scott Labs. There's a bank of people there waiting to help you with any of these questions. Okay. Can you suspend sodium bentonite with wine to avoid dilutions? You have to use water, right? You
have to use water.
Okay.
So you saw on that one picture with the 1% tartaric acid solution. Yeah. Should I go back? Can I go back? Can they still see?
You can, but this is kind of a lightning round, but go for it.
Okay. So you can see that it doesn't open up as well as with just plain water.
Okay.
So no, it's got to be water.
Got to be water.
One thing that you can do, you can swell with the appropriate amount of water, and you'll see, we see this picture. Nope, not that one. Your bentonite's going to settle. You can rack off a lot of that water, leave a little bit so you can get a slurry going, and then add to your barrel or add to your wine if you're worried about all that water add. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, totally. Okay, so this is a lightning round. So these guys' questions, guys, we're going to just say yes or no to these questions. And if it's too fast, we're going to please contact us or email us with those questions. So if you bento crossflow right.
Wait, Darren, I can't hear you.
When do you cold stabilize? The answer is you probably have cold stabilized by then, right? But do you recommend stabilization? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Hello?
Yeah, I got you.
Okay. When do you cold stabilize, before or after heat stabilization?
So typically I would say if you're doing standard bentonite without crossflow, you're going to probably, most people actually do protein and cold stability at the same time. So you're going to have to do a trial. You're going to cold stabilize it, do a trial with your Blanco Bent UF in the lab to determine dose rate. And then on that wine that you've determined the dose rate, dose a sample of that wine with the dose rate and then run it through your cold stability test again to confirm that you're still cold stable. It should be. It's not going to have a huge effect, but it potentially could. I've seen sometimes wines, because there are some proteins or things that proteins are connected. I'm going to send an email about that. Lightning round. Cool. Keep going.
All right. Yeah. So we did confirm that Blanco Bank UF does work with other filters besides crossflow, correct? But you do recommend if you need to rack it off beforehand, you might have to add some gelacol.
Yes.
Or can they? Okay. Do you recommend storing remaining bentonite for later vintage? You know, do you recommend storing it, like making a big bunch of it and then store it indefinitely?
Like make it hydrated?
Yeah, rehydrated and stored for a reasonable amount of shelf life. Do you agree?
No, you
say
store
yes
it,
or no
you
on that?
store it dry. You store it dry. You don't.
But you can't make a solution up hydrated and store that for any length of time.
No.
Okay. Do you know any difference between warm and cool climate wines when using bentonite? Probably not. I mean, I don't know.
I don't, but I can get that info. We have people who know cold climate better than I do. So I don't have a good answer.
That's quite a question. Okay. And then when you use would you use a calcium-based bentonite over a sodium-based bentonite?
I wouldn't. And
that's because
and that's because my background and what my clients are striving for is a protein stable wine. So if you don't care about protein stability and you just want some clarification, you can use some calcium, but no, I'd use sodium or blended.
Okay, perfect. This must be a smaller winemaker. Can you blend the bentonite and water in a kitchen blender?
I suppose you could.
I mean, it's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, so in bigger facilities, you use the drill with the paddle on it. I worry about the shearing. I don't think that's an issue. I'm unsure. If I think about it now, I'm getting unsure.
Okay. There's a question about bentonite needed to activate pectinase enzymes. And I mean, the quick answer is you don't need very much. Would you agree with that? You don't need very much bentonite.
To deactivate them?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, not much at all. So, no, keep going. Lightning round.
All right. Yeah. Do the rules of bentonite change when making meads? How about meads and bentonite? Did we talk about this the other day? Do you need to use bentonite meads? Does honey have a lot of protein in it? I don't think it does, but do you have any comment on that?
Well, I was speaking to a mead maker and he assures me there are proteins in mead. And then I was talking to one of my coworkers who's made mead and says there aren't. So I don't have the mead industry is not as large. And so I haven't played with enough mead to know, to be honest. I thought waxes were more of a problem in mead. But,
wax. You mean like for downstream processing? The crystallization, I suppose, the when it's not
I just had a client that I always helped. I sold them some filtration aid years ago, and they still email me, and they had waxes. That was their issue.
Oh, bummer.
Yeah.
That is bummer.
Yeah.
What do you suggest with another, and it's another barrel-aged Chardonnay question. Okay. What do you suggest with barrel-aged Chardonnay? How do you keep your lees when you rack off Fermobent and go to barrels? So this must be a fermentation question. What do you do with your lees if you want to do Surly's aging when you've used Fermobent? And do you suggest? So you're gonna leave all your lees behind, and you're gonna have to purchase a specific inactivated yeast like Noblesse, so that you have some lees to age on. And that's why Fermobent may not be the best tool for barrel fermented and aged. Does that make sense? Okay, maybe they should do juice fining before that and then rack in, then ferment. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, and then go ahead. No, go ahead. Sorry. I'll take all day, Darren, if you let me. So no. How do we, it says definitely from your, can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay, it's just tough around here sometimes. Generally, I was really impressed with the presentation and especially about the importance of hard water because, we deal with well water up here. There's a lot of people that deal with their own wells, especially in your ag situation. Yep. The water around here is super hard. The only other place I've run into hard water so much was in Goleta, where I used to live, in Santa Barbara. I know area. Goleta, yeah. Yeah, so it was way difficult. So somebody asked, should I be using distilled water to hydrate? Well, no.
No, you don't need to, but you can. You could probably be fine with regular bottled water. Distilled, I forget what the issue is with that. Take his name and email, and we'll look into that. There seems to be something in my mind that distilled is not the best for bentonite.
Yeah, okay. Maybe it's just a total. It's somewhere in the middle where the water hardness is lower, but you don't need to go as far as just removing all the salts. Okay,
right.
Yeah. It's just like a lot of things. Rarely have I ever heard when asked the question, especially with like rehydrating, yeast or bacteria, you definitely don't want to use distilled water. And just quite frankly, it's typically not very available for us. Well, as far as everything else goes, I think that's what we got. That was great. I really appreciate it. It was really nice. I apologize. There was a clicking sound when I was giving the intro. I don't know what that was about because it did not happen during our practice. And but I do want to thank everyone again. If we missed anything, please don't hesitate. The email, Maggie, can you throw up your email one more time, Maggie? You have Maggie's email that
Maggie
you can talk
M
to.
at scottlab.com. Whoa, let's go back. There we go.
Perfect. Yes, and then there's always me. If you got any comments, please fill out the survey again. We do want to do continual improvement. And part of that is emailing me. But fill out the survey. Again, thank you so much. And all of us at Scott Labs want to wish you all a very, very healthy family, healthy life, and especially during this crazy time. And it will get better, everyone. We'll go back to normal. Well, thank you, Maggie. Thank you again.
Thank you, Darren. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for everything.